Hello, I'm here during the lunch rush with Janice, who owns her own food truck.
Best cheesesteaks in town.
Janice traded up to Geico Commercial Auto Insurance for her food truck business. We're here where she needs us most.
They sure are.
We make it so easy for her to save, with customised coverage that grows with her business. Sorry, I just get so emotional talking about saving folks money.
Not this onion I'm chopping?
It's just so beautiful. Oh yeah, no, it's the onion.
Get a commercial auto insurance quote today at geico.com and see how much you could save. It feels good to Geico.
Yay Networks.
I'm Molly Kimball. Welcome to Fueled, a wellness and nutrition podcast. I'm a registered dietitian and nutrition journalist with a passion to help people live their strongest, healthiest life possible. In my weekly TV segments and columns, there's a limited amount of time and space to cover everything, but there's so much more to share. This podcast is my opportunity to dive deeper into the topics you want to know about. This week's podcast is about anti-aging strategies that also can pull double duty as post-workout recovery strategies, because I love it when a treatment or a protocol that we know is effective for one issue is shown to be beneficial for another. It's like taking multitasking to the next level without even trying. This is the case with some of the emerging anti-aging science. So these very strategies that we know are effective for post-workout recovery, and we'll talk about these, we'll be breaking these down. These strategies are now showing promise in also helping us to slow down or even reverse the aging process. So we know that optimal recovery from exercise is integral to our training process. If we are just everyday average workout people, same for professional athletes, we need to have that optimal recovery to help us perform our best in our next workouts. Also, just to feel our best in our day-to-day lives and in around our workouts. We also know that aging can negatively affect this recovery. It may affect it a little bit, it may affect it a lot, but regardless, it can feel like it really affects it a lot. So one common factor that is involved in both post-workout recovery and also in aging is inflammation. We've talked about that a lot before on this podcast. And while some inflammation can be a good thing, so for example, like right after you work out, there's low-level inflammation. This is essential for healing of those maybe minor muscle tears that we had during that workout. So a little bit inflammation can be a good thing, but chronic inflammation is not. Another common factor is the type of information that is in our body's cells. This includes genetic and epigenetic information. So genetics are what we're born with. These are pretty much predetermined for us. And epigenetic information determines just how these genes that we're born with are expressed. So science shows us that we actually can influence those epigenetic factors, those factors that help influence how our genes are expressed. We can influence these with lifestyle approaches like physical activity, intermittent fasting, optimal sleep. All of this can help to translate to improved health and also longevity. There's also some evidence that some of the very therapies that have been traditionally used to enhance post-workout recovery may also activate some of those very same epigenetic pathways. So treatments like cryotherapy, which means cold therapy, or infrared or heat therapy, for example, these are tried and true approaches for sports performance recovery. We've read about professional athletes incorporating these into their training and recovery regimen for years. And these strategies like cold therapy and heat therapy, may also help us to slow down or potentially even reverse the aging process. I am joined today by Dr. Nicholas Goyeneche, special guest for this week's podcast. He and I will explore the science behind these key strategies, along with practical advice for layering these into your lifestyle. Dr. Nicholas Goyeneche is a triple board certified, fellowship trained physician who specializes in the unique field of physical medicine and rehabilitation, or PM&R, at Ochsner Health. He's been in practice since 2015, and he completed a year-long sports medicine fellowship at the Andrews Institute in Gulf Breeze, Florida. While he was there, he trained under national leaders in the field of orthopedics, regenerative medicine, and sports medicine. As you'll hear, Dr. Goyeneche is a wealth of information. He shares it very easily. He speaks in a way that's easy for us to take that science world, and he helps us translate it into real life stuff that we can understand. And Dr. Goyeneche works really closely with orthopedic surgeons, physical therapists, athletic trainers, registered dietitians, chiropractors, all to help correct underlying issues with the goal of restoring maximal function to individuals that he works with. So with that, welcome, Dr. Goyeneche. I'm excited for you to join us today.
Yeah, I appreciate the invite. Glad to be on.
So tell us about your expertise, your area of expertise with physical medicine and rehabilitation. The area of specialty is physiatry. I think a lot of people are not familiar with that. Talk to us about what this is specifically, what makes it different.
Sure, yeah. If I say the term physiatry and someone knows what that is, I'm actually surprised. And so we as physiatrists, we're the second smallest medical specialty behind neurosurgery, but definitely the most misunderstood, and because there's so much overlap between what we do with other specialties. But basically, our main focus is to restore maximum function to our patients. And, we can do that in different ways. Some physiatrists are inpatient rehab physicians, so where if someone has a stroke or a spinal cord injury or traumatic brain injury, and they're rehabbing them to achieve their maximum level of function despite their neurologic injury. As for me, I did an extra training fellowship year in sports medicine, so I focus more on orthopedic type issues, but also some neurologic issues as well in terms of concussion and things like that. So I'm not a surgeon, and so I kind of look at the non-surgical options, which are growing in number, to help my patients get back to their function, the things they like to do without having surgery. So it's a very rewarding field, and it's getting more popular for sure.
And some of the things that we'll be talking about today of cryotherapy, heat therapy, contrast therapy, acupuncture, these are things that are some of those modalities that can give people relief without surgery. And it may be able to help people either avoid it or at least postpone or delay or make their quality of life better without surgery.
Definitely. Yeah, it's always, as a human being, no one wants to be unhealthy. No one wants to be in pain. And so all of these things can help in that regard, keeping people healthy and doing that for an extended lifespan.
So what in your background drove you to this? How did you become interested in this specific aspect of medicine?
Well, I did come from a semi-medical family. My mom was a nurse, and her father, my grandfather, was a physician. And I had that exposure to the medical field from an early age. But my thing was sports. I want to be an athlete, and getting hurt from time to time and finding myself in the doctor's office. And, I felt like, well, it'd be cool to work in sports, but, I had this medical background too that I was very familiar with. And so I kind of set off from the point of high school to do something in sports medicine. And physiatry is one of several specialties that allow you to practice in that domain of sports medicine. But I do enjoy treating the athletic population a lot, or covering sporting events, races, and games, and that sort of thing. But also enjoy treating more sedentary people, or weekend warriors, or avid exercise people. Like I said, to improve their function and quality of life.
And one of the groups that you work with, kind of the patient subsets, is an aging population, and they're coming to you with different things that are aches, pains that, you can help them with, but you've also learned a lot from them along the way as well.
Definitely. I would say about half my practice is made up of patients that are above the age of around 50, and I have some patients that are 100 years old and above, and there's really not a day that passes that at least one patient says to me, "Don't get old. Aging is not fun." And at least one patient a day. So hearing that every day,
wild, yeah,
every day for years, it's kind of made me sad, or made me, oh gosh, well, not much to look forward to. It's going to be a decline, and we're all exposed to our grandparents and seeing older people and a decline in function and moving around and the cognition part, and there's really been some groundbreaking stuff that has come out in the past few years, and looking at extending not only the years we have on Earth, but the quality of those years, and making us healthier for a longer period. And some of that translates to the acute kind of post injury or post exercise, post sport recovery as well. So it's really a growing interest, a growing part of my practice. It's also a very exciting part in the field of physiatry too, to incorporate that in helping our patients be healthier for a longer period.
It's fascinating that approaches that are traditionally used, or maybe not traditionally, but becoming a little bit more mainstream for athletic performance and recovery, that we'll be talking about, things like cryotherapy, heat therapy, the contrast therapy, these have been more and more widely accepted in sports performance use. We hear professional athletes using them, but to start to kind of flip this and say, wait, these are not only for performance and recovery enhancers, but these also can help have, quote, anti-aging effects as well. And I think it's a really cool thing that as a physician, for you to not just hear that from your patients, but number one, like, you're hearing it, you're compassionate and empathetic to that, and thinking, wow, this is a sad thing that I'm hearing this. And I'm sure it's like, it makes you, the compassion you're having for the patient, but then also a little bit of that personal fear that we have about our own mortality and how we're going to age ourselves. I think it's a very cool thing that you've heard that, you've let that affect you, and you've let it drive you to have that greater interest and greater research into some of these, quote, anti-aging strategies that we'll be talking about.
Yeah, for sure. And we all, like I said, we all want to be healthy, and that's why we exercise a lot of times, and that's why we do certain diets, things that may not, be easy, but we do those things to make us healthier. And who doesn't want to do that? But also, it's important, as a physician, to be a role model too, and do things that I'm recommending to my patients and doing personally as well.
I think that's a beautiful thing. It doesn't always happen, and when it does, I think it's very inspiring to the patient. So we will be talking about all the strategies we'll be talking about are for recovery and can be used for recovery, but we'll also be talking about them under the lens of, okay, aging can be viewed not as something that's simply inevitable, but as sort of a disease state, and that some of the aging process, of course, not all, but some elements of it can be possibly reversed in some cases. And if it's not as extreme as being reversed, at least it can be slowed or delayed or halted to some degree. And we'll be talking about diet and exercise because, as you mentioned, like, those are really key parts. I think when we look at what can we start doing right now to improve how we age, what our quality of life is going to be in our years as we age, what our quality of life is right now, today, no matter what age we are, what we eat and our physical activity are huge. We've talked about that a lot, though, on this podcast, so we'll kind of sum it up towards the end of this, but I really wanted to spend our time with you talking about these strategies that are a little bit unusual and not as familiar to people. So let's let's start with cryotherapy. And I guess we'll talk through each and, share with our listeners what it is, how it can be effective, and what some of the science is on it. But talk to us about cryotherapy and what that even means.
Sure. So you're basically lowering the temperature of your surroundings to lower the temperature of your body. So that produces different physiological effects. And so basically, our bodies want to preserve our internal organs and keep those at the optimal temperature. So you vasoconstrict, so your blood vessels will constrict from your peripheral hands and feet to produce more blood pooling in your abdomen area, perfusing your more important organs. So, and that can be done through different ways. If you're immersing in colder water, or the kind of newer chambers that use liquid nitrogen to essentially freeze the air to very cold temperatures. And these things are becoming more mainstream, and we will be getting our own chamber at our clinic, hopefully in the next few weeks or months, to be able to use that on our patients and athletes. But
so cryotherapy being cold therapy, essentially, and cryotherapy, there's two main ways, I guess. So the chamber, as you mentioned, a cryo chamber, or the cold water immersion. And we'll kind of talk through both of these. And I think we have at Ochsner Fitness Center a cold dip, and it's set at, I believe, like right at between like 49 and 52 degrees Fahrenheit. And I have started doing that. And, I've worked there for over 20 years, and I've eyed up that cold dip, and I'm like, no, thank you, because that is really cold. And it was actually over quarantine. I ran into a couple at the grocery store, and they said, oh my gosh, it's a husband and wife. We can't wait for the fitness center to open. And they do a lot of endurance events in normal times. They do a lot of triathlons and that kind of stuff. And they're both in their late 40s. And they said, we can't wait for it to open because we miss the fitness center, but we especially miss the cold dip. And I said, oh, y'all do that on a regular basis? And they were such believers in the benefit of this cold dip. And we call it the cold dip, but it's, the cold water immersion, as you'll read different studies and stuff. But this cold dip, they were such believers in it, of how it helped them with recovery, muscle soreness. They were like, Molly, like that is our fountain of youth. And I'm like looking at them, and I'm like, they believe in it so much that during quarantine, while our fitness center was closed, they would buy gallon jugs of water, freeze them, and fill their bathtub with them. And submerge and make their own cold dip at home, because they found it was so healing, their muscle soreness, their muscle, post-workout muscle recovery. They felt like that was the key for them to train and perform like they wanted to. And that really kind of got me thinking, because I was like, I have overuse injuries, hip injuries, and I take a lot of supplements. I take collagen. I do certain things that, and I've stopped running. I've changed up my workouts, but there's still that kind of constant level of pain or inflammation that just is always there a little bit. So I've personally started doing our cold dip, and I actually really like it. And I never thought that I would. Have you done done a cold dip before personally?
Not routinely. I have, jumped in a pool during wintertime. It doesn't feel good initially, but
right.
After you're in there, if you weather the first few seconds, it does kind of ease up.
Well, what I'm looking at in that is to try to stay between 10 and 15 minutes, and we'll talk more about the research on all of this. But so the first time I did it, it was once we opened back up after quarantine. I was like, it was just a mind over matter. I was like, I've got to go. I'm going to go do it. And it's just a small little kind of a sliver of a space. So I quickly walked down the steps, and I just wore my normal, I did it after a workout. So I just still had on my normal shorts and shirt and stuff like that. And I took my shoes off, and I got in there. And for me, the main place that I feel that soreness is basically from the waist down. So I didn't get in there up to my neck. I got in there from about, middle of the core down. But what I felt was the limiting factor for me, and I couldn't take it, was my feet. And so I think the skin on my feet is like really thin, and it was just really painful. So I found what works for me is to get down in there quickly. I'll kick my feet up. So just, even my legs are all the way in there, but just the tops of my feet, like right by my toes and the little tendons there, are out in the air. And I find it's the first probably not even minute, but after the first 20 or 30 seconds, you sort of settle in and you don't really feel it's not such a discomfort. And for me, I do find a strong benefit of it. The cryo chamber that Dr. Goyeneche mentioned that we'll be getting, that's very different. So it's the air is cold. And so I mentioned that the cold dip, the cold water immersion, ours is set, in that 49 to 52 degrees. But talk to us about how this is different and what the temperature is like and the process. So I kind of just described the cold dip process. And some people, athletes may do it as much as twice a day. It's ideal if you can do it after every workout. For me personally, it doesn't always work out. But when I can do that cold dip post-workout, I'm striving to incorporate that. So talk with us about what the protocol looks like for these cryo chambers.
Sure. So one of the, I guess you can say, pluses of the cryo chamber in comparison to the cold water dip, it is a quicker session. So you're looking at 2 or 3 minutes inside the chamber, and the temperature gets pretty darn low. So it's about negative 165 degrees Fahrenheit, and that does sound almost unhealthy that you can get that low. But for 2 or 3 minutes, it's kind of a dry air in there, and that's what you do. So we're still trying to figure out, okay, what's the optimum timing to do something like that? What's the optimum frequency to do it? I did see some literature that is kind of recommending the cold sessions, whether it's immersion or cryotherapy in the chamber, to be kind of postponed, not directly after the exercise, because when we exercise, there is some inflammation that gets generated. But is that actually a bad thing or not? The term inflammation really gets vilified, and people are like, oh, all inflammation is bad. We need to quash it down any way possible. But some of that is there for a reason, and our bodies have evolved and adapted to essentially build things up. And there's some inflammatory cells that help us recover from an exercise bout. So like you're inducing some micro tears or damages to the muscle tissue, and some inflammatory cells get released, but those cells can help signal to rebuild the tissue. So, just like anything, too much of anything can be a bad thing. So, but the research that's out, that it seems to suggest that maybe delaying the cold session maybe several hours after the athletic endeavor or the day after. But it's all kind of interesting things that hopefully the research comes out with a more definitive answer to that.
For me, that would make it a lot more convenient, because it isn't always convenient to do it right after. But I've kind of felt like that would be the best time. So I'm happy to hear that, because if that workout is in the morning at my house, then, and it doesn't take long. It's not like it takes a big chunk out of my day. I can just trot over there, do that cold dip 10 minutes, 15 minutes, and then pop out. I've also, a note there, I found that having a distraction is key. So if I have something I need to bring to read, I'll bring that with me while I'm there, because having something to get your mind off of the fact that you're in 50-degree water. On the chamber, it's interesting because it is so cold there that there's actually many of them have like a little adaptation, smaller space that you would go into first for a shorter period for your body to start to adapt. And then you would go into that really cold cryo chamber that Dr. Goyeneche was talking about. And some of the things that I've read are like making sure you don't have any sweat on your skin, because if you do, it's so cold, you could risk your skin burning and damaging your skin tissue. And so there's things that are like, it's not something to do just kind of willy-nilly. Like you've got to do it under like very specific guidance under that, by that health professional who's well trained in it.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. And the wide receiver in the NFL, Antonio Brown, made headlines for getting frostbite on his feet. I believe it was last year in a cryo chamber. So, yeah, I mean, the temperature is that low. Obviously, you need to take the appropriate precautions.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, as long as it's supervised by a trained professional, it's very safe. We know that.
And when we start to look at, okay, what's some of the, there's great literature reviews that have looked at the benefits of cryotherapy. And so it has been used more and more commonly in sports medicine for recovery from injuries. It can be from trauma or from overuse. It has the effect, that anti-inflammatory effect that we were talking about. And it can help with that exercise-induced inflammation, that soreness. So there's a lot of benefit there. So if someone's got things like that pain or muscle spasms, swelling, any of these kind of overuse symptoms, something like cold water immersion or a cryo chamber may be something to consider. I thought it was really interesting as we were looking through this and educating myself a little bit more about this. I saw that there was a physician, years ago, half a century ago, who noticed that his patients, when they would come back from winter holidays or they'd been at, some sort of a mountain type vacation place, when they would come back, that symptoms of things like rheumatoid arthritis were improved and he started to attribute it to the movement they were having, but also the cold that they were experiencing. And that's where he started studying some of this whole body cryotherapy. So I thought that was a interesting kind of it's been around for centuries where people have done, immersion into different types of cold bodies of water. I mean, this is something that's been not just in the past 100 years, it's been centuries. Let's take a minute to talk about Kenco, sponsor of this week's podcast episode. So I've mentioned before that I incorporate a fresh vegetable juice daily. It's a blend of all types of greens plus beet, ginger, and more. And consistency with any healthy habit is key. So I'm always on the lookout for a portable option to take with me when I'm not at home and don't have access to my usual freshly pressed juice. So I am loving Kenco's rainbow of delicious smoothies that are ready in less than a minute. Kenco makes legitimately nutritious smoothies for busy people on the go. It's no secret that smoothies can quickly become sugar-packed calorie bombs, but Kenco smoothies are only made from organic whole fruits and vegetables. They're flash frozen and slow dried to lock in all the fiber and nutrients, nothing added and no fiber taken out. So Kenco smoothies, they're so easy to make. There's no blender, no juicer, no kitchen even is needed. Just pour the Kenco packet into water or your favorite milk or milk alternative, shake it up, and you're all set. Go to kenco.com, take their quick nutrition quiz, and fill your flexible monthly order with your choice of 15 functional flavors that match your goals and your taste. To start creating those healthy habits right now, go to kenco.com/fueled, pick out your flexible monthly plan, and the first 100 listeners will get 25% off your first order. That's kenco.com/fueled and get 25%. You love the show and we love you, so get the special deal. 25% off for the first 100 listeners at kenco.com/fueled. So can you walk us through what is happening on a cellular level during cryotherapy, whether it's cold water immersion or these cryo chambers? What's happening to our red blood cells, our white blood cells, that's responsible for these benefits?
Sure. So we all know if you have an acute injury, what do? You put ice on it. So ice is a vasoconstrictor, and it basically you're not you're reducing the amount of blood flow to a particular area. So you're reducing blood flow, you're reducing the amount of inflammatory cells that are deposited in that area. So this goes back to what you're saying, though, that physician noticed the people with rheumatoid arthritis and those sort of things, which are inflammatory arthropathies, would be reduced, when they're exposed to cold. So the same is true for cryotherapy, whether it's immersion or a full body chamber. You're going to reduce inflammation, and that's borne out in the literature. Looking at the CRP, which is C-reactive protein, which is a marker of inflammation in the blood, and that will decrease with the routine use of cryotherapy. But like I said earlier, okay, is that a great thing? In moderation, probably so. But if you get it too much, you're reducing perhaps some good inflammation to, stimulate your body to grow. But reducing inflammation is an obvious factor from a cellular level that does happen with cryotherapy. And then the subjective, soreness after exercise, pain, that seems to consistently be improved with the routine use of cryotherapy, both in immersion and the cryo chamber. Some literature showed some slight superiority in terms of the whole body cryo compared to cold water immersion, but it is a very slight difference. But they both are effective in reducing the subjective muscle soreness, and that probably goes back to you're reducing inflammation. So some of that causes it irritates the nerves in the muscles, so you sense pain from those athletic endeavors. So you're reducing the soreness, and some of the research showed improved muscle function or improved muscle force. So, and that kind of makes sense as well. And you're not having as many inflammatory cells or fluid or kind of intramuscular swelling after the cryotherapy, and so your muscles are kind of ready to go essentially and produce more force. So there was also a study looking at these professional rugby players in Italy, and they were looking at more of the hormonal responses, and they did find increased testosterone and lower cortisol levels, which cortisol is a stress hormone. Just after one day, and they had 2 sessions on one day, and that did produce those hormonal changes. So that's interesting as well. So, and then getting into the whole metabolism and the concept of brown fat.
Yeah.
Which, so people are more familiar with white fat.
Break it down for our listeners, because I think maybe our listeners are like, I don't know what color my fat is. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, yeah. Hopefully most people don't know what their fat looks like. But if you've seen a surgery on the Discovery Channel or something like that, and, most fat is essentially white. It appears white. But you also have tissue that's brown fat. So it's basically a darker color. And it's darker because it has more mitochondria in these cells, which the mitochondria are the energy producers in our cells. And so when we're born, when we're a child, we have more quantities of this brown fat. And for whatever reason, we just kind of lose that as we age. But we all have it, even if we're elderly. And it's mostly found kind of in the torso area, the upper back, or the shoulders. And research clearly indicates that the activation of the brown fat is increased when there is cold exposure. So that ramps up the mitochondria in that brown fat, producing more energy, kind of ramping up our metabolism, which is a good thing.
So the beneficial effect that it's having on inflammation, the small study on rugby players with influence on testosterone, the positive effect it has on our brown fat, and encouraging and enhancing our body's ability to enhance that energy metabolism of the brown fat. So there's a lot happening here. One thing that we saw was it was discussing the impact of that cryotherapy on hemolysis of our cells, and that this stimulated the release of erythropoietin, or EPO. And EPO is, a lot of people might be familiar with it. I think of it's what Lance Armstrong used to illegally dope for cycling, to give him the competitive edge on cycling. So what would be if something like cold water immersion or cryotherapy is triggering a cascade of reactions that could possibly stimulate the release of EPO in our bodies, what would be the implications of this? How would this benefit us?
So if we're stimulating more production of erythropoietin, you're going to produce more red blood cells, which carry the oxygen in our blood. So, I guess most importantly, the implications for someone who does cardiovascular exercise or endurance athletes can effectively utilize more oxygen to carry to their cells and their muscles to feed them with the energy. So that certainly, if there is more EPO, that would be a positive beneficial effect for an endurance athlete especially.
And whether or not that's something that there's some science supporting this, but there's a lot more supporting all these other aspects that we've talked about, which also in turn, if you're looking at an endurance athlete, that couple that I was talking about in the grocery store, so is it possible that it was also benefiting their EPO, the triggering that release possibly, and influencing their red blood count? But also we know it's very likely that it was doing all these other benefits that we've talked about. So when we're talking about cryotherapy, and what are the different ways that you can do it? And there's the cold water immersion, using a place like Ochsner Fitness Center in our cold dip, or there's the cryo chamber, which we currently don't have one. I don't know that I know of one in New Orleans. There may be, but there's wherever someone is listening to this around the U.S., what is there a place near you that has a cryo chamber? They're going to be few and far between. We are going to be getting one with Ochsner in our performance training facility, but it's not very common. It would be a lot easier for a lot of people to do a cold water immersion, again, following that couple's lead that I was talking about, and they're icing down their bath water, so that's something that from a logistical standpoint, it might be easier for someone to do cold water immersion. But let's talk about who needs to use caution. Before considering this cryotherapy, if there's people with certain types of disorders that, if you're listening to this, we want to say, hey, wait, kind of course, giving that word of advice of check with your physician, especially if you have these types of issues. So who would you caution against doing this?
So I would say if you're kind of an advanced diabetic where you may have microvascular disease, so you already have kind of poor blood supply to your distal limbs like your toes and your fingertips, so you're already getting lower blood flow to them. And then if we vasoconstrict even more, you may be more likely to get a burn type, a frostbite type injury from something like that. Or if you have, an open wound, we don't want to reduce blood flow to the skin at all, even though it's just for a short time. And there's certain blood conditions that it's kind of rare where someone has a cold sensitivity to, and if you have struggle with cold weather, just going outside, it's obviously you wouldn't go in a chamber or a cold dip if you have problems with that. But
What if someone has high blood pressure, hypertension issues, or also cardiovascular disease? Is there a contraindication there?
Kind of relative. So, I mean, if your blood pressure is really out of whack, really, really high or really hard to control, that needs to be better controlled before you consider going in a chamber. And same thing with cardiovascular disease. If it's more on the severe end, you've had multiple surgeries and things like that, it's definitely appropriate to get your physician, your cardiologist, to give the okay for that. But if minor elevations in blood pressure, hypertension, or cardiovascular disease, should be safe for those people to partake.
Okay. So as we've talked about the host of benefits, I think as we look through the literature, there's a lot of science on cryotherapy, the benefits we've talked about, most notably inflammation, minimizing the oxidative stress caused by exercise and just our daily activities, improving the muscle damage parameters, our fatigue, recovery, levels of pain. So there's a lot that's based in science on this. When we look at the amounts, for most people, doing it just one time is just like anything. It's not going to really tell you if this is beneficial. Doing this on a regular basis, whether it's for weeks or months, several times a week, is going to be ideal to see what type of benefit this is having. So it's one of those things that if you do it once or twice, that's probably not enough to determine, is this really going to be helpful for you? So just like anything, we need to be consistent. So switching gears from our cold therapy, to our heat therapy, the infrared therapy specifically. There's now infrared saunas that are popping up around cities where you can go and get your heat therapy there. But what does the science tell us about heat therapy and infrared type therapy?
Sure. So obviously the opposite. We're increasing the temperature of our surroundings and increasing our body temperature. So our blood vessels will vasodilate and to bring blood more closer to the skin, so we can have more heat that escapes our body to keep that homeostasis and that temperature zone that your body wants to be in to function optimally. So, heat stress or temperature stress, whether it's cold or hot, it seems to mimic the beneficial effects of exercise. So, in the heat side, if you're in a infrared sauna, if you're in a dry sauna, a steam room, you are sweating. Your body's trying to cool itself, and so you are losing some fluids, so some volume. So your heart rate should go up to compensate to maintain your blood pressure, and so that's the same mechanism with which when we exercise, our heart rate increases, and so it seems to kind of produce a similar physiologic response than exercise, and so we think that's how people are getting the benefits of repeated heat therapy.
And I'm seeing there's, some of the research is showing that it looks like there's benefit for nerve regeneration, wound healing, even an adjunct to an accompaniment to cancer treatment, and that our nerve cells are responding well to infrared radiation. So this is, when I first saw the infrared saunas popping up, to me it seemed like strange, and there's a lot of claims that go out about it, but to see that there is at least some science showing that there is a benefit to that.
I will say that the science, the research, it's coming, it's growing. However, you think about it, it's challenging to do the high quality research, like a placebo controlled trial where some people are getting the treatment, some people think they are but aren't. so you can't really fake.
Right. You can't fake out any of these things we're talking about. Right.
Right. You can't fake it, cold or heat like that. So it is a challenge to get that high level of study. But one interesting study I did see came out of, I believe it was Finland or Norway. So the use of saunas is a huge part of the culture up there for obvious reasons. And they did see a correlation with the individuals who use the sauna over 4 times a week compared to those who just did it once or less. The people who used it more, over 4 times a week, had a 40% reduction in all-cause mortality. And so that's cardiovascular disease, pulmonary disease, neurodegenerative disease like Alzheimer's and strokes and stuff like that. So that's certainly very interesting.
And when we talk about heat therapy, that's these infrared radiation saunas that we're talking about that are popping up in areas, but it can also be a steam treatment. Like you have a type of a steam treatment in your home.
I do. Yeah. So it's raising the temperature. It's a wet heat, but we're raising the temperature of the surroundings, and essentially your body is heating up. And so your blood vessels will dilate and your skin, and you will sweat. And yeah, when I'm in there for more than 10, 15 minutes, I feel like my heart rate going up. You feel relaxed, but you feel that heart rate, so that physiology is changing. And so it almost feels like you exercise, once you're out of there. And so
we want to be clear to listeners, you haven't. So it doesn't take the place of your exercise.
That's correct.
Yeah,
That's correct.
I see people coming out, like they'll come to our fitness center and they don't work out, but they'll do the sauna or the steam room and they'll get their good sweat going and then they leave. It's like, well, yeah, you did part of it.
Yeah. Well, I will say that's better than nothing, because right. Like I said, we're going over the science, and there does appear to be benefit of that. But yeah, ideally you're not going to just hang out in the sauna or, cold dip and the exercise does right. trump those other things.
So there's, things like steam, which is the wet heat, things like a sauna, which would be the dry heat, and then the infrared therapy, which is some of these spas that are popping up. And it's those infrared therapies that it looks like there's potential for, again, that the neural stimulation, that nerve regeneration. There's potential at a cellular level for as an adjunct to cancer treatment. There's also the infrared radiation. There's a small bit of science that shows it may be protective on our skin, helping to slow the effects of photoaging. So there's a lot of claims that can be made based on what might be small studies with these infrared saunas. So I have to say I'm a little bit still skeptical of these. It's harder for me to also wrap my head around it than it is the cryotherapy that we talked about. So there's cryotherapy, and then there's the heat therapy we talked about, and then there's contrast therapy, which is basically a blend of both. So tell us about that.
Yeah, so you're basically bouncing back and forth between a hot source and a cold source, whether it's water, a cold dip immersion, or a hot tub, or a cryo chamber, or a sauna. But so you're just kind of going from one extreme to the other, and just like a lot of these things, there's some parts of this that we don't fully understand, how it works or why it works. One of the theories is that I mentioned the cold vasoconstricts, the heat vasodilates, and so and our blood vessels are lined by muscle and smooth muscle. So you're going back and forth. So you're essentially working out the muscles of your blood vessels, constricting and relaxing, constricting, relaxing. It's believed that it does, just like working out. You don't use it, you lose it, and so it keeps tone and kind of just elasticity of your blood vessels. And, you're kind of getting some of the benefits of both cryo and, perhaps reducing inflammatory markers, activating brown fat, and then the heat, improving blood flow, getting blood flow to the tissues to feed them with nutrients, but also remove toxins as well.
And when someone does it, it would not be, in these cases, it's not necessarily that cryo chamber to then go into as a sauna. A lot of times it's a milder version of that. We should be clear. You mentioned Norway of one of the studies, and one of the things that was fascinating to us, we were in Norway a little over a year ago. It was our first time ever there, and we were exploring Oslo, and we got to this area where there's water, there's the fjords, there's the glaciers, and you're basically seeing just these glaciers going into the water there. And just, it was one of the first sunny days they'd had in quite some time. And so the town was like, people were out and about and enjoying the non-rainy weather. And as we got closer to this body of water, this fjord, we hear just music blaring, and we hear screams, and we're like, what is this party happening? And so we get closer to the water, and along the edge of the water, there's all these wooden huts lined up along, and there's restaurants, there's bars, there's they had a farmer's market. So imagine if it's your downtown area where you would have all the normal things, shops, restaurant, bars, all this, along that waterway, there was a giant opera house there. And along the little waterway, there's all these wooden huts. And we look and we're just standing there, just staring. The music is blaring coming from these. And there's, guys, women, all in their swimsuits, and they're dancing around. And what these huts were is saunas. And so they're in the sauna with the music, dancing around, they're drinking beer and cheering. And then they would be in the sauna, and then they would jump into this ice cold glacier water. And then that's where the screams would come. And then they would be there, and then back and forth. And we just stood there watching it. It was this is wild to watch. So they were essentially, whether they are specifically aware of it or not, they were getting a rush. Clearly, they were getting a huge rush from doing it, but they were also doing contrast therapy in a very specific way.
Yeah, contrast party, I guess you could say.
Right. So throw in your music and a little booze and all your friends, and it might feel a little bit better to do that. So when someone is doing it though, in a normal space, is there a certain amount of time if someone says, okay, I'm going to do, let's say a steam room or a sauna and then that cold dip, would it be 5 minutes in each, 3 minutes in each? What would you recommend if someone said, I really want to give this a go?
Well, it depends on the temperature of the different areas, the cold and the hot. So it can vary widely. Essentially the more extreme the cold or hot would be, the shorter the duration would be for you to be in there. So, we know usually the cryo stuff and the cold plunge will be about 10 minutes, 10, 15 minutes. But if you're in a sauna, it's usually around 20 or so minutes. But I've talked to people who, I'm in a sauna for an hour, but that's generally going to be unhealthy. And so it's hard to recommend a set time, but it's
so it could be something like a steam or a sauna for 10 minutes, cold dip 10, steam or sauna 5 or 10, and then cold dip 5 or 10 to have the back and forth a bit.
Yeah, that's generally going to be, and then of course we're all busy people, and so I guess we don't have all day to go back and forth. So
sometimes I see people at our fitness center, and they do seem to have all day to go back and forth, which let's bring that up too, because we had just this week on one of our leadership calls for the fitness center, our manager on duty mentioned that we had a code earlier, and he said, it was one of those again. They do steam room, sauna, cold dip, hot tub, and they make the rounds multiple times, and it's someone who is elderly, who has blood pressure issues, and their pressure drops, they pass out. And the next thing you know, they were trying to do this, beneficial therapy, and now they're on their way to the ER. And so we want to caution that that's one where definitely ask your physician first. Is there any reason I shouldn't do this? Especially if you have issues with blood pressure, we would probably say don't do it. Err on the side of caution. And if you wanted to do one, say that cold dip, the cold water immersion, and you wanted to start small, do that. Talk with your physician first. But if you are someone that struggles with issues with blood pressure, we can say probably it's not going to be a good idea to do the back and forth from the hot to cold, and certainly not without physician approval or guidance on that as well.
Yeah, that's correct. And the contrast therapy, especially if you have medical conditions affecting cardiovascular system, the contrast therapy does put a little bit more stress on that system. So definitely caution in that regard, and you definitely want to talk that over with your physician before you do that. And one other condition, cardiovascular wise, if you have arrhythmias, and so if your heart beats in a different fashion, that extreme cold temperatures and heat can exacerbate those as well. So
good point.
The heart, yeah.
And when we talk about contrast therapy versus those benefits we talked about with cryo or cold therapy, when we look at data from a compilation of multiple studies, the majority of it shows that yes, if you do that contrast therapy, the back and forth, hot, cold, it can help with things that are enhancing recovery after exercise, improving muscle soreness, reducing muscle strength loss. There are benefits that can be seen with this compared to doing nothing or just passive recovery or just resting. But there seems to be not as much difference between that contrast therapy, the benefits of that, and other interventions like that cold water or cryotherapy. So all the benefits we talked about with that cryotherapy, cold water immersion, or the cryo chambers, you're going to be getting that, and we're not so sure that there's going to be added benefit or much added benefit by doing that contrast back and forth, so, and the risks go up with that as well. All right, so we've talked about cold therapy with cryotherapies. We've talked about heat therapies with the infrared type, and then contrast, which is the blend of both. And then separate from these physical modalities, there's also diet type interventions. And when we look at anti-aging, there's a big advocacy for, I'm not a big fan of this term as it's used, but calorie restriction, and the abbreviation is CR. And so people will do, quote, do CR or calorie restriction. And that, though, calorie restriction, which kind of is very specifically related to intermittent fasting, there's a lot of research on the benefit of, quote, calorie restriction and slowing the aging process. So talk to us a bit about that from your perspective.
Yeah, so it's really fascinating how we're understanding better why we age. From a biochemical standpoint, it comes down to weathering damage. And so our life is constantly throwing insults and things our way that can damage our DNA. And so whether it's things we're eating, toxins we're putting on our body that we're breathing in, sunlight, x-rays, radiation, exercise, mental stress. There are over 2 trillion breaks in our chromosomes every day, just from everyday life. And so, obviously our human bodies have become very efficient in terms of repairing ourselves. And so that's what it comes down to is slowing aging is optimizing our ability to repair DNA damage. And so in terms of calorie restriction, the more we eat, the more we take in, the more our bodies are having to devote resources to process nutrients in food. Of course, we need certain nutrients to live. Obviously, you can starve to death So we need what we need, but essentially not anything more. So it's a fine line. And but essentially the DNA in our bodies are kind of crumpled up into these balls essentially, and these enzymes called the epigenome are imperative in terms of helping to repair damage and turn on and turn off different genes. And so the analogy I like to use is if you have people over to your house all the time. I mean, people are they're tracking in dirt. They're essentially you have to clean up more frequently to keep your place neat. Suppose if it's just you or your significant other, it's easier to keep your place clean. So if your body's constantly in flux with calories and food, it takes some resources for your cells to clean out toxins. And so when you reduce your calories, your cells essentially kind of hunker down and make themselves more clean and neat, and the DNA is folded more properly, and things shift to more of a survival mode. And that is clearly borne out in science. And but who wants to walk around all day hungry?
Right.
Not me. But it is that line between getting what we need, but not overdoing it, and that goes for pretty much everything.
And the calorie restriction, I think, it sounds very harsh. I mean, it sounds very clinical. It sounds very harsh. It's not something that a lot of people would say, ooh, I want to do that. I want to try that. But when we look at intermittent fasting, that's essentially what it is. And the kind of that extra work that Dr. Goyeneche was talking about of having to, you're cleaning house all day with this metabolism of the foods that we're having, and you're dusting out the tracks that your friends have brought into your home, that is minimized with intermittent fasting. And so and also I should mention this, we have, with just like I don't love the phrase calorie restriction, with intermittent fasting, I don't love that it's often referred to as your feeding window or an eating window. I think that that's bizarre terms. And so, it's like, oh, my feeding window or my eating window just opened up. So instead, I use and I encourage our team and our listeners or viewers to use the phrase fueling window. And I think that it's a lot more about nourishing our bodies and fueling our bodies during that versus just feeding, So during that fueling window, it's limited, but also part of what intermittent fasting will incorporate is a window between your last meal and bedtime. So you may leave a 3-hour gap between when your last meal is and bedtime. And all of that is helping our body use those sleeping hours to repair, to rejuvenate, to restore, versus digesting and having to work on maybe some things that we put with that mindless nighttime snacking. So we've done an entire podcast. I've done several different podcasts specifically on intermittent fasting. So we've covered a lot about the different types of physical approaches with cryo and heat and contrast or mixed therapies. But we definitely wanted to mention that calorie restriction is another very significant approach to anti-aging, reversing the natural occurrences that are going to happen with aging. But also on a cellular level, inflammation level, it can help with things like recovery and helping with some of these symptoms of post-workout soreness. So intermittent fasting is something that can be beneficial for a lot of people, and I'll link to that specifically. And then all of this that we've talked about, of course, we should say, is not to replace all of your baseline stuff, your traditional rest and refueling and hydration. Those strategies that you've known your entire life are still essential. That is your core and your foundation. These things that we're talking about are additional. They kind of give us that extra edge. So Dr. Goyeneche, what's kind of your 101 about traditional rest, refuel, rehydration?
Sure. And so let me talk about a kind of a little story that I like to tell people about. I was working in a research lab. This was before medical school, And randomly on this day, my head scientist mentioned that, hey, there's this interesting lecture at lunchtime today over at Tulane University. Would you like to go? And I said, sure. All right, might as well. And he offered to buy me lunch, even though it's against calorie restriction. But we went over there, and I was really captivated. It was a researcher from Stanford who basically has spent his entire career studying baboons in Africa. Baboons have a very intricate social network that most closely resembles human beings. So they're smart. They have evolved to the point where they don't need to spend all day long searching for food, and they have more time on their hands to essentially irritate each other and cause each other psychological stresses like we tend to do. And he's basically a guy that lived amongst these baboons. Kind of like to sing like a baboon, you have to be a baboon,
Right.
essentially. And so he looked at cortisol levels, which is the stress hormone, in different kind of classes of baboons, the like type A or the alpha males and whatnot. And basically it was a bell-shaped curve where the baboons with the highest levels of cortisol had shorter lifespans. Interestingly, baboons with the lowest levels of cortisol also had very short lifespans. So, it suggests that, our bodies are meant to undergo stress, whether it's exercise or calorie restriction, or heat or cold. That optimizes our cellular function. But certainly we can overdo it. And so good sleep and rest are essential. So if there is no, miracle here. Everyone wants to be healthy, or if you're an athlete to be the best, but it's pretty easy to overdo it. And so our bodies need time to recover. There's just no way around it. I do some of the new stem cell injections and platelet injections in my practice to improve healing of injured tissue, but those things are still a process. It's not an overnight success. And so, our bodies are fantastic machines, but they need time to heal. And so the simple things can't be overlooked. And good sleep, taking time between exercise sessions, and hydrating to help your muscles function optimally and flush out toxins.
Is there a certain number of days a week that you would say take a break? And what should that break look like for people from exercise? I mean,
yeah, that is tough to generalize for everyone, and it depends on so many factors, and each individual and your age and what you're actually doing from day to day. I mean, you could go in and do some light weights, and you certainly want to do anything really intense, whether it's a really intense bike ride or intense weightlifting session. It's hard to do that every single day.
right.
I mean, you will.
But a lot of
start
people
to break
try
down.
to. They feel like they haven't succeeded unless they're doing some intense workout 7 days a week. So I'll usually encourage those clients who are that, let's have one day where if you are doing something, maybe it's just a walk or it's yoga or stretching. So psychologically, they feel like, yes, they're doing something, but it isn't that intense workout. Is that kind of in line with how you would recommend?
Yes. Yeah, I think every day people should do some form of fitness, whether it's as simple as going for a walk or doing some stretching at home. And it's hard. I mean, honestly, I don't do that every day. Just life gets in the way and you're busy, but it should be a goal, and that's clearly beneficial psychologically and physically.
I think our listeners are probably there's probably three categories. There's some who have that good balance. Maybe they're doing 4 or 5 days a week. Most days they're getting something in movement wise, and they have some of those days where they don't, and that kind of naturally builds into their rest day. Then we probably have some of our listeners who are like, I'm really not doing much physically, and I really need to get into some sort of regular movement. And then there's a third category of our listeners who are, they do a spin or cycle class, they do a boot camp class, they're doing these really intense workouts, high intensity, high performance type workouts every single day. And so if you're one of those people, then listen to what we're saying and give yourself a break one of those days. And again, still moving is fine. And it can be what we would call like an active recovery, something like a leisurely walk or yoga or stretching or something like that. But definitely giving yourself a little bit of that rest period. And you mentioned sleep and the importance of sleep. And we actually just recently it actually ended up being a 2-part podcast on sleep with a sleep researcher, Dr. Erin Hanlon. She's out of the University of Chicago. So for our listeners, if you haven't listened to that, it's fascinating and you would love it, Dr. Goyeneche. She studies, she's doing these sleep studies that we read about that are looking at metabolism, that is looking at the effect of sleep deprivation on, young, healthy, lean individuals, then what happens when they are sleep restricted for even just 4 days. And she looks at the metabolism or metabolic effects on their, markers for blood sugar, for insulin resistance, everything goes up. So basically someone who is in their 20s and otherwise healthy after 4 days of significant sleep restriction metabolically is looking like someone in their 60s who's pre-diabetic. It's just mind-blowing how much of a difference that makes. So we have covered a lot today, from cryotherapy, heat therapy, the contrast, kind of a blend of both, touching briefly on calorie restriction, or more specifically intermittent fasting, which I'll link to those podcasts. But again, none of this is to take the place of our basic foundation, those principles that Dr. Goyeneche is talking about of rest, rest in the form of sleep, rest in the form of not training hard every single day, rest, refueling, hydration. That's kind of our baseline. These others that we're talking about are to give us that extra boost, that extra edge. Is there anything else for our listeners that we haven't covered, or just anything else that you want to share as we're wrapping up?
Yeah, I think we covered a lot in detail. And I think to summarize, I think it's basically making sure that we are stressing our bodies to some extent in moderation, whether it's exercise, calorie restriction, heat, cold, but focusing on the recovery aspects and rest as well. And those things hopefully will keep us young and keep us healthy for an extended lifespan.
And staying on the lookout for the new and emerging science on these treatments that we're talking about, and looking for them to pop up in your area too, and trying them out when they do. Always doing it safely, running it by your physician. If your physician isn't familiar with these treatments, don't let that discourage you. Just because they may not be familiar doesn't mean they might not be a fit for you. So seeking out a physician like Dr. Goyeneche is a physiatrist, someone who specializes in sports medicine, working with, that may be someone who, and again, don't let the phrase sports medicine think, oh, I'm not an athlete. You heard the other types of patients that Dr. Goyeneche works with. So it may not be something that your everyday physician is that familiar with. So maybe seeking out a specialist who can guide you a little bit on these types of treatments as well. I really appreciate your time. Thank you for sharing your insight on this. And I'm excited to continue to learn about it as our science evolves in these areas too.
Yeah, Molly, I really appreciate the invite. Had fun talking. And yeah, it'll be an exciting time to see how things evolve over the next, 10, 20, 30 years.
And we can't wait to try that cryo chamber when it arrives. All right. Thank you. Talk to you soon.
Okay. Sounds good. Thank you.
So we covered a lot today. The main thing centered on cryotherapy, heat therapy, and contrast therapy. And as we said, let's be very clear. None of these are intended to be miracle treatments. These also do not replace the core fundamentals of getting sufficient rest, fuel, and hydration. But each of these do fall into that category of every little bit helps, giving us that extra edge that can enhance our recovery, our athletic performance, and just may help to slow down or reverse at least part of the aging process. A huge thank you to Dr. Goyeneche for sharing his insight with us, sharing his expertise, and I'll include the links that we talked about in the show notes of this episode. And let me know what you think as you incorporate some of these strategies, especially if you're jumping into that cold dip. I want to hear about it. I always love hearing your feedback. I am registered dietitian Molly Kimball, and you've been listening to Fueled Wellness and Nutrition, the podcast. If you would like more Fueled Wellness and Nutrition, please head over to mollykimball.com, and you can follow me, Molly Kimball RD, on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. And if you haven't yet, please go to Apple Podcasts and subscribe, rate, and review this podcast. Join us next week for another dose of Fueled Wellness and Nutrition. Thanks for listening, and stay focused on living your strongest, healthiest life.